Okay, we're back again. Next thing we're going to do here is The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism by Friedrich Nietzsche. An attempt at self-criticism. Whatever may lie at the bottom of this doubtful book must be a question in the first rank and attractiveness. Moreover, a deeply personal question. In proof thereof, observe the time in which it originated, in spite of which it originated, the exciting period of the Franco-German War of 1870-71. While the thunder of the Battle of the Worth rolled over Europe, the ruminator and riddle lover who had to be the parent of this book sat somewhere in a nook of the Alps, lost in riddles and ruminations, consequently very much concerned and unconcerned at the same time, and wrote down his meditations on the Greeks. The kernel of the curious and the almost inaccessible book to which this belated prologue or epilogue is to be devoted. A few weeks later, and he found himself under the walls of Metz, still wrestling with the notes of interrogation he had set down concerning the alleged cheerfulness of the Greeks and of Greek art, till at last, in that month of a deep suspense, when peace was debated at Versailles, he too attained to a peace within himself, and slowly, recovering from a disease brought home from the field, made up his mind definitely regarding the birth of tragedy from the spirit of music. From music, music and tragedy. Greeks and tragic music. Greeks and the artwork of pessimism. A race of men, well-fashioned, beautiful, envied, life-inspiring, like no other race hitherto, the Greeks indeed. The Greeks were in need of tragedy, of art, wherefore Greek art. We can thus guess where the great note of interrogation concerning the value of existence had been set. Is pessimism necessarily the sign of decline, of decay, of failure, of exhausted and weakened instincts, as was the case with the Indians, as is, to all appearance, the case with us modern men and Europeans? Is there a pessimism of strength, an intellectual predilection for what is hard, awful, evil, problematical in existence, owing to well-being, to exuberant health, to fullness of existence? Is there perhaps suffering in overfullness itself, a seductive fortitude that the keenest of glances, which yearns for the terrible, as for the enemy, the worthy enemy with whom it may try its strength, from whom it is willing to learn what fear is? What means tragic myth to the Greeks of the best, strongest, bravest era, and the prodigious phenomenon of the Dionysian, and that which was born there of tragedy, and again, that which died, the Socratism of morality, the dialectics, fullness of later Hellenism, mirroring a glowing sunset. The Epicurean will counter to pessimism merely a precaution to the sufferer. And science itself, our science, I viewed as a symptom of life, what really signifies all science, whither worse still whence all science. Well, is scientism perhaps only fear and evasion of pessimism? A subtle defense against truth, morally speaking, something like falsehood and cowardice, and, unmorally speaking, an artifice. O Socrates! Socrates, was this perhaps secret, O mysterious ironist, was this perhaps thine irony? What I then laid hands on, something terrible and dangerous, a problem with horns, not necessarily a bull itself, but at all events a new problem. I should say today it was the problem of science itself, science conceived for the first time as problematic, as questionable. But the book in which my youthful ardor and suspicion then discharged themselves, what an impossible book must needs grow out of a task so disagreeable to youth, constructed of not but precocious, unripened self-experiences, all of which lay close to the threshold of communicable based on the groundwork of art. For the problem of science cannot be discerned on the groundwork of science. A book perhaps for artists, with collateral, analytical, and retrospective aptitudes, that is, an exceptional kind of artist for whom one must seek and does not even care to seek. Full of psychological innovations and artist secrets, with an artist's metaphysics in the background, a work of youth, full of youth's mettle and youth's melancholy, independent, defiantly self-sufficient, even when it seems to bow to some authority and self-veneration. In short, a first-laying work, even in every bad sense of the term. In spite of its senile problem, affected with every fault of youth, above all, with youth's prolixity of youth's storm and stress, on the other hand, in view of the success it had, especially with the great artists to whom it addressed itself, as it were, in duologue Richard Wagner. A demonstrated book, I mean a book which at any rate sufficed for the best of its time. On this account, if for no other reason, it should be treated with some consideration and reserve, yet I shall not altogether conceal how disagreeable it now appears to me, how after 16 years it stands a total stranger before me, before an eye which is more mature and 100 times more fastidious, but which has by no means grown colder, nor lost any of its interest in that self-same task, essayed for the first time by this daring book, to view science through the optics of the artist, and art moreover through the optics of life. I say again, today, it is an impossible book to me. I call it badly written, heavily painful, image angling and image entangling maudlin, sugared at times even to feminism, even in tempo, void of the will to logical cleanliness. Very convinced, and therefore rising above the necessity of demonstration, distrustful even of the propriety of demonstration, as being a book of initiates, as music for those who are baptized with the name of music, who are united from the beginning of things by common ties of rare experiences in art, as a countersign for blood relations in Artibus, a haughty and fantastic book, which from the very first withdraws even more from the forum fulgus of the cultured than from the people, but which also, as its effect has shown and it still shows very well, how to seek fellow enthusiasts and lure them to new byways and dancing grounds. Hood of the scholar, under the German's gravity and disinclination for dialectics, even under the bad manners of Wagnerian, here was a spirit with strange and still nameless needs, a memory bristling with questions, experience and obscure ties, beside which stood the name Dionysus. Like no one more note of interrogation, here spoke, people said to themselves with misgivings, something like a mystic and almost magnetic soul, which, undecided whether it should disclose or conceal itself, stammers with an effort and capriciously as in strange tongue. I have sung this new soul, and not spoken. What a pity! What did I not dare to say what I then had to say as a poet? I could have done so, perhaps, or at least as a philologist. For even at the present day, well nigh everything in this domain remains to be discovered and disinterred by the philologist. Above all, the problem that here there is a problem before us, and that so long as we have no answer to the question, what is Dionysian, The Greeks are now as ever wholly unknown and inconceivable. Ay, what is Dionysian? In this book may be found an answer. A knowing one speaks here, the votary and disciple of his God. Perhaps I should now speak more guardedly and less eloquently of a psychological question so difficult as the origin of tragedy among the Greeks. A fundamental question is the relation of a Greek to pain. His degree of sensibility, did his relation remain constant, or did it veer about? The question whether his ever-increasing longing for beauty, for festivals, gaieties, new cults, did really grow out of want, privation, melancholy, pain. For suppose even to this to be true, and Pericles intimates as much in the great funeral speech, when the opposite longing which appeared first in the order of time, the longing for the ugly, the good, the resolute, desires the old Hellene for pessimism, for tragic myth, the picture of all that is terrible, evil, enigmatical, destructive, fatal at the basis of existence. When then must tragedy have sprung? Perhaps from joy, from strength, from exuberant health, from overfullness. And what then, physiologically speaking, is the meaning of that madness, out of which comic as well as tragic art is grown? The Dionysian madness, what perhaps madness is not, necessarily the symptom of degeneration, of decline, of belated culture. Perhaps there are a question for alienists, neurosis of health, of folk youth and youthfulness. What does the synthesis of God and goat in the satyr point to? What self-experience, what stress made the Greek think of the Dionysian reveler and primitive man as a satyr? And as regards the origin of the tragic chorus, perhaps there were endemic ecstasies in the eras when the Greek body bloomed and the Greek soul brimmed over with life. Visions and hallucinations which took hold of entire communities, entire cult assemblies. What if the Greeks, in the very wealth of their youth, had the will to be tragic and were pessimists? What if it was madness itself, to use a word of Plato's, which brought the greatest blessing upon Hellas? And what if, on the other hand, and conversely at the very time of the dissolution and weakness, the Greeks became also more optimistic, more superficial, more histrionic, also more ardent for logic and the logicizing of the world? Consequently, at the same time, more cheerful and more scientific. Despite all modern ideas and prejudices of the democratic taste, may not the triumph of optimism, the common sense that has gained the upper hand, the practical and theoretical utilitarianism, like democracy itself, with which it is synchronous, be symptomatic of declining vigor, of approaching age, of physiological weariness, and not at all pessimism? Was Epicurus an optimist because a sufferer? We see it as a whole bundle of weighty questions which this book has taken up upon itself. Let us not fail to add its weightiest question, viewed through the optics of life. What is the meaning of morality? Already in the foreword to Richard Wagner, art and not morality is set down as the properly metaphysical activity of man. In the book itself, the proposition recurs time and again that the existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon. Indeed, the entire book recognizes only an artist's thought, an artist's afterthought behind all occurrences, a God, if you will, but certainly only an altogether thoughtless and unmoral artist God, who in construction as in destruction, in good as in evil, desires to become conscious of his own equable joy and sovereign glory, who in creating worlds frees himself from the anguish of fullness and over fullness from suffering of the contradictions. Concentrated within him. The world that is the redemption of God attained at the very moment as the perpetually changing, perpetually new vision of the most suffering, most antithetical, most contradictory being who contrives to redeem himself only in appearance. This entire artist metaphysics, call it arbitrary, idle, fantastic, if you will, the point is that it already betrays a spirit which is determined someday, at all hazards, to make a stand against the moral interpretation and significance of life. Here, perhaps for the first time, a pessimism beyond good and evil announces itself here, that perseverance of position obtains expression and formulation against which Schopenhauer never grew tired of hurling before his angriest imprecations and thunderbolts. A philosophy which dares to derogatorily put morality itself in the world of phenomena, and not among phenomena in the sense of idealist terms, but among the illusions as appearance, semblance, error, interpretation, accommodation, art. Perhaps the depth of this anti-moral tendency may be best estimated from the guarded and hostile silence with which Christianity is treated throughout this book. Christianity as being the most extravagant burlesque of the moral theme to which mankind has hitherto been obliged to listen. In fact, to the purely aesthetic world, interpretation and justification taught in this book, there is no greater antithesis than the Christian dogma, which is only and will be only moral, and which, with its absolute standards, for instance, its truthfulness of God, relegates, that it disowns, convicts, condemns art, all art, to the realm of falsehood. Behind such a mode of thought and valuation, which, if at all genuine, must be hostile to art, I always experience what is hostile to life, the wrathful, vindictive counterwill to life itself. For all life rests on appearance, art, illusion, optics, necessity of perspective and air. From the very first, Christianity was essentially and thoroughly the nausea and surfeit of life for life, which only disguised, concealed, and decked itself out under the belief in another or better life. The hatred of the world, the curse on the affections, the fear of beauty and sensuality, another world, invented for the purpose of slandering this world, the more at bottom a longing for nothingness, for the end, for rest, for the Sabbath of Sabbaths. All this, as also the unconditional will of Christianity to recognize only moral values, has always appeared to me as the most dangerous and ominous of all possible forms of will to perish, at the least as a symptom of a mortal, most fatal disease of profoundest weariness, despondency, exhaustion, impoverishment of life. For before the tribunal of morality, especially Christian, that is, unconditional morality, life must constantly and inevitably be the loser, because life is something essentially unmoral, indeed, oppressed with the weight of contempt and the everlasting no. Life must finally be regarded as unworthy of desire, as in itself unworthy. Morality itself what? May not morality be a will to disown life, a secret instinct for annihilation of principle, of decay, of depreciation, of slander, a beginning of the end, and consequently the danger of dangers? It was against morality, therefore, that my instinct as an intercessory instinct for life, turned in this questionable book, inventing for itself a fundamental counter-dogma and counter-valuation of life, purely artistic, purely anti-Christian. What should I call it? As a philologist and man of words, I baptized it, not without some liberty, for who could be sure of the proper name of the Antichrist? The name of a Greek god I called Dionysius. You see which problem I ventured to touch upon in this early work, how I now regret that I had not the courage or immodesty to allow myself in all respects to use of an individual language for such individual contemplations and ventures in the field of thought that I labor to express in Kantian and Schopenhauerian formula. Strange and new valuations which ran fundamentally counter to the spirit of Kant and Schopenhauer, as well to their taste. What foresaw were Schopenhauer's views on tragedy? What gives, he says, in Whiteley's Willy and Vosilong, to all tragedy, that singular swing towards elevation is the awakening of knowledge that the world, that life cannot satisfy us thoroughly, and consequently is not worthy of our attachment. In this consists the tragic spirit. It therefore leads to resignation. Oh, how differently Dionysius spoke to me! How far from me then was just this entire resignation! But there is something far worse in this book, which I now regret even more, having obscured and spoiled Dionysius' anticipations with Schopenhauer formulas, to wit, that in general I spoiled the grand Hellenic problem, as it had opened up before me, the admixture of the most modern things, that I entertained hopes where nothing was to be hoped for, where everything pointed all too clearly to an approaching end, that on the basis of our latter-day German music, I began to fable about the spirit of Teutonism, as if it were on the point of discovering and returning to itself, the very time the German spirit, which not so very long before had the will to the lordship over Europe, the strength to lead and govern Europe, testamentally and conclusively resigned, and under the pompous pretense of empire founding, effect its transition to mediocrity, democracy, and modern ideas. In very fact, I have since learned to regard this spirit of Teutonism as something to be despaired of and unsparingly treated, as also our present German music, which is romanticism through and through, and the most un-Grecian of all possible forms of art, and moreover a first-rate nerve destroyer, doubly dangerous for a people given to drinking and revering the unclear as a virtue, namely in its twofold capacity of an intoxicating and stupefying narcotic, of course apart from all precipitate hopes and faulty application, to matters specially modern, which I then spoiled my first book. The great Dionysian note of interrogation set down therein continues standing on and on, even with reference to music. How must we conceive of a music which is no longer romantic like the German, but of Dionysus? So with that, we'll stop for now.